The call came in at 7:04 a.m. By 7:12, the excavator had stopped. It wasn't a gradual shutdown, no warning light, no slow grind, no cough of protest from the engine. The 95-ton machine simply ceased. One moment it was moving earth, the massive arms swinging in a low arc across the foundation trench of the Hartwell Crossing Bridge. The next, it was still. Dead still. The kind of still that doesn't belong on a working site. The operator, a man named Rees who had been running heavy equipment for 19 years, sat in the cab for a moment without moving. He checked his gauges. He checked them again. Then he climbed down slowly, the way men do when they don't want to be the one who has to explain something. Workers stopped. Not all at once, it happened the way crowds stop, in a ripple. Someone near the concrete pump looked up. Someone by the materials staging area turned. Within 90 seconds there were 14 people standing in a rough cluster around the dead machine, and not one of them was touching it. The project manager, a thin-faced man named Ellison, was on his phone before the second minute. The site engineer was pulling up diagnostics on a tablet. Two mechanics from the service trailer were jogging across the gravel lot, tool bags slapping against their hips. By 7:28, the site superintendent had called the operations director. By 7:34, the operations director had called Natalie Voss. She arrived at 7:51, which meant she had driven fast and made no stops. She wore a dark blazer over a field shirt, and she walked like someone who had already decided what the problem was and was simply waiting for the site to confirm it. She scanned the cluster of workers, the silent machine, the mechanics with their tablets and their frowns. "What do we have?" she said. It wasn't a question. Ellison walked her through it. Hydraulic pressure appeared normal on the readouts. Engine hadn't seized, it had simply stopped taking commands. No fault codes that made sense. The excavator had last been serviced 11 days ago. All maintenance logs were current. Natalie listened without interrupting. When Ellison finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the machine. "Who authorized the service 11 days ago?" she asked. "Standard interval. Per protocol." She nodded slowly. "Get the manufacturer on the line. I want a field tech here by noon." That was when someone at the back of the group said quietly, "He's here." Nobody moved for a second. Then Natalie turned. The man walking through the gate wore a jacket that had once been brown and was now something closer to the color of old work. He carried a toolbox, not a bag, an actual metal toolbox, the kind that belonged to a different era of industry, and he walked with the unhurried pace of someone who had already assessed the situation from the parking lot. Natalie looked at the site foreman. "Who is that?" The foreman opened his mouth, closed it. "He called this morning. Said he heard about the shutdown." "Heard from who?" I wasn't sure. He said he knew the 390F series. I thought. You let a stranger onto a state infrastructure site because he said he knew the machine." The foreman said nothing. The man had stopped near the machine. He hadn't approached anyone. He hadn't introduced himself. He set his toolbox down on the ground and stood with his hands at his sides, looking at the excavator. Not at the engine bay. Not at the hydraulic lines. He was looking at the base of the arm assembly, then at the cab, then back down. He wasn't looking at what everyone else was looking at. Natalie walked toward him. "You need to identify yourself," she said. He looked at her briefly. Then he looked back at the machine. "Logan Mercer," he said. "Give me a few minutes." He didn't ask permission. He didn't explain further. He crouched down beside the machine and opened his toolbox, and the way he did it, unhurried, certain, like a man sitting down to a meal he had prepared himself, made three of the mechanics exchange a glance. Nobody said anything else. Logan studied the machine. Not the gauges. Not the fault readout that Ellison was still holding up on the tablet. He was looking at the machine itself, at things that had no digital representation, at the places where metal met metal, at the slow story the equipment told if you knew how to read it. He reached out and touched the hydraulic housing. Not a test. More like confirmation. Then he stood up, opened a specific tray in his toolbox, and selected a tool without hesitating. Outside the site gate, past the orange construction fencing and the temporary signage, Logan's truck sat on the gravel shoulder of the access road. It was a dark blue pickup, mid-90s, the kind of vehicle that had been maintained rather than replaced. There were no decals on the side panels, no magnetic placards advertising a company name or a service. The bed held a second toolbox, secured with a single ratchet strap and a folded tarp. The cab was clean in the way that working vehicles become clean, not from deliberate tidiness but from daily use stripping away everything unnecessary. In the passenger seat, a girl sat reading. She was 7, or would be in 6 weeks, and her name was June. She had her father's coloring, dark hair, a stillness around the eyes, and she read the way certain children read, which is to say with the rest of her body completely forgetting to exist. Her feet were tucked under her. The book was a chapter book, already half finished, held in both hands. Logan had said he'd be a few minutes. June had nodded, the way she nodded when she already understood the situation better than the words described it. She had been to sites before. She knew what a few minutes meant when her father said it at a gate like this one. She had brought 2 chapters worth of patience. The truck windows were down. Morning air moved through the cab, still carrying some coolness from the night before. June turned a page. On the radio, low enough to be nearly absent, someone was talking about weather. Inside the gate, Logan had set his toolbox down and was crouching near the base of the excavator arm. June couldn't see him from where she sat. She didn't try to look. She turned another page. A security guard, a young man in a reflective vest who had been posted at the gate since 6 a.m., had watched Logan walk through without stopping him. The foreman had waved him through. Now the guard stood with his thumbs in his belt loops, uncertain whether he'd done something wrong. He looked at the truck. At the girl reading. He looked back toward the cluster of workers around the machine. He said nothing. There was something about the truck's position that a careful observer might have noticed. Logan had parked it neither directly at the gate nor at the far end of the lot. It sat at an angle, facing outward, pointing back toward the road. It was the kind of parking that allowed for a quick departure without a 3-point turn. Practical. Unobtrusive. The kind of choice that looked like nothing and was not nothing. Inside the gate, Logan had moved. He wasn't near the cluster of engineers and mechanics anymore. He had crossed quietly to a different position, between the machine and the site office trailer. It was a subtle shift, perhaps 20 feet, and it changed what he could see. From where he stood now, he had a sight line to the hydraulic panel on the machine's left flank, to the base of the operator's cab, and, if he turned slightly, to the door of the office trailer, where the maintenance logs were kept. Nobody on site appeared to have noticed the repositioning. June turned another page. The morning light was flat and white, the kind that comes before the sun has climbed enough to cast proper shadows. It made everything on the site look two-dimensional: the yellow equipment, the pale concrete forms, the people in their hard hats and high-vis vests. Logan's truck sat on the shoulder, pointed toward the road. June read her book. A foreman walked past the fence line without looking at the truck. A delivery vehicle pulled up, checked in, pulled through. The guard went back to watching the gate. Inside the fence, the excavator was still silent. After a while, June reached the end of a chapter. She held the book closed on her lap for a moment, not looking at anything particular. Then she opened it again and kept reading. She had learned to be good at waiting. Not the restless kind, not the watchful kind. The kind that was simply adjacent to patience, a quiet occupying of time while something else resolved itself. It was a skill that suited her. Most people who met her for the first time commented on how calm she was for a child. They said it like a compliment, and she accepted it like one, though she had never thought of it as something she had chosen. She simply understood, in the wordless way children understand things they have grown up around, that some problems required more than a few minutes. That the few minutes was an estimate, not a promise. That her father would come back when the machine was ready to come back. She turned another page and kept reading. 12 years earlier, Logan Mercer had an office with a window. It was not a large office, and the window faced a parking structure rather than anything scenic, but it was an office, a desk, a door that closed, a whiteboard with 3 colors of marker, and it meant something in the way that offices mean something in large organizations. It meant he had arrived somewhere. It meant people brought problems to him and expected solutions, and the solutions he provided were good enough that the problems kept coming. He was Chief Equipment Systems Engineer at Harlan Forsyth Global, a firm that managed infrastructure projects across 11 countries. His title meant, in practice, that he was responsible for the mechanical integrity of every piece of heavy equipment deployed on Harlan Forsyth's sites: the excavators, the compactors, the cranes, the graders, the concrete pumps. He wrote maintenance standards. He designed diagnostic protocols. He trained regional engineers in the methodology he had spent a decade refining. He testified before project review boards and answered questions from procurement officers and quietly corrected the assumptions of men who had twice his years in the industry. He was 34 years old when he did all of this. He was, by any reasonable measurement, exceptional at it. The protocol he wrote in his 4th year at Harlan Forsyth, a 73-page document titled Equipment Systems Maintenance Interval Standards for Heavy Civil Projects, later revised twice and condensed into an internal operations reference, became, within 3 years of its publication, the baseline that half a dozen infrastructure firms in the region were using. It specified service intervals for hydraulic systems under variable load conditions. It outlined diagnostic sequences for fault identification when electronic readouts produced conflicting data. It addressed the gap between what sensors measured and what was actually happening inside a machine under sustained stress. The document had Logan's name on the title page of its original version. By the time it was adopted as a standard reference at Vaughan Infrastructure, the firm currently running the Hartwell Crossing project, his name had been replaced by the Harlan Forsyth corporate header. Standard practice. The knowledge persisted. The attribution did not. He had known this would happen. He had not objected. In his 7th year at Harlan Forsyth, his wife, Claire, was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Logan was in Oslo for a project review meeting. He flew home that night, a flight that took 9 hours, and he sat in the window seat without sleeping, looking at nothing, thinking about things that had no resolution. What followed was not a dramatic unraveling. It was quieter than that, a gradual reallocation of priorities that happened the way water finds a path, not through force but through persistence. He took leave. He came back. He took leave again. He restructured his schedule, requested remote accommodations, negotiated reduced travel. The firm accommodated him, to a point. Then it stopped accommodating him. In his 9th year, Harlan Forsyth offered him a lateral promotion that would have required relocation to their Singapore regional office. The position offered more authority, more compensation, a larger team. It also required him to be on the other side of the world from his wife and from June, who was 3 years old and had recently begun to string sentences together in a way that made Logan stand still in doorways just to listen. He declined the relocation. The firm accepted his decline. And then, over the following 18 months, with the thoroughness of institutional drift, his responsibilities were redistributed. Not stripped, redistributed. His name moved off project rosters. His access to equipment specifications narrowed. His office, when his lease on it came up for renewal, was quietly reassigned to someone else. He was not fired. He was simply made peripheral, in the way that large organizations make peripheral those who will not move where the organization requires. He resigned on a Wednesday morning. He cleaned out his desk in under an hour. He drove home, where Claire was in a good stretch. She had good stretches and bad stretches, and this was a good one. And she made coffee and they sat in the kitchen and talked about something small and inconsequential. He did not tell her the details of the resignation until that evening. When he did, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Good." He began taking independent consulting work. Not the kind that comes with a firm name attached, not the kind that gets featured in trade publications. The kind that gets passed through personal networks, offered quietly, paid in modest increments. He fixed things. He diagnosed things. He went to sites when sites needed someone who knew something specific, and he knew something specific about almost every machine currently running on a civil project in the region. After Claire died, June was 5. It was a spring afternoon, and the light was exactly the wrong kind of beautiful. Logan continued working. He bought the truck. He found a small house with a yard that June could manage. He arranged his schedule around her school calendar and her appointments, and the hours she needed someone present, and he built a working life that fit inside that arrangement rather than around it. He did not talk about Harlan Forsyth. He did not talk about the protocol. He did not carry any documentation with him to prove what he had once been, or what he had built. He carried a toolbox. He knew what was in it, and he knew what the machines needed. That was sufficient. Logan worked without commentary. He had moved to the hydraulic panel on the machine's left flank, the panel that the mechanics had already examined, that Ellison's tablet had already queried, that the manufacturer's remote diagnostic line had already pinged. He opened it with a key he'd retrieved from his toolbox without searching for it. He didn't consult notes. He didn't reference a manual. He looked at what was there. The filter housing sat at the center of the assembly, flanked by 2 pressure lines. To the uninitiated eye, it looked correct. The gauge reading was within tolerance. The seals showed no visible breach. Ellison had photographed it 40 minutes ago and sent the image to the manufacturer's technical line, and the technical line had said the filter appeared nominal. Logan placed 2 fingers on the housing and pressed, very gently, in a specific location. He held that position for approximately 4 seconds. Then he moved to the pressure relief valve, a component seated further back in the assembly, partially obscured by a coolant line that had been rerouted at some point during a previous service. The valve had a calibration indicator marked in degrees. The tolerance range was printed on a placard beside it, plus or minus 1.5 degrees from center. The valve read within that range. Logan looked at it for a moment, then retrieved a precision measurement tool from his toolbox, a small instrument that most of the mechanics on site would have recognized but none were currently holding, and took a reading. The valve was 3 degrees off specification. Not toward the extremes. Not in a direction that would register on standard diagnostics. 3 degrees in a direction that looked, on every gauge in the cab, like normal operation, until the machine was under load, at which point the pressure dynamics shifted in a way that the system's logic interpreted as a shutdown condition. It was the kind of fault that didn't announce itself. It was the kind that hid inside normal readings and waited. Logan set down the measurement tool and picked up a wrench. He worked on the filter first. The blockage wasn't a failed filter, the filter itself was fine. It was an accumulation at the intake port, a buildup that had developed over several service cycles without crossing the threshold that would trigger an alert. He cleared it in 4 minutes. Then he turned to the relief valve and made a careful adjustment, 3 degrees in the correct direction, checking twice against his measurement tool before securing the fitting. He checked the hydraulic lines for secondary effects. Pressure redistribution sometimes created downstream issues that would surface later if not addressed now. He found nothing that concerned him. He closed the panel. He walked to the cab and climbed up. The operators and mechanics standing nearby watched without speaking. Ellison had stopped typing on his tablet. Natalie, standing at a distance of roughly 15 feet, had not moved in several minutes. Logan sat in the operator's seat. He ran a brief pre-start sequence, not the standard sequence, something slightly different, something he was doing from memory, and then turned the key. The excavator started. Not with any drama. Not with a heroic cough and shudder. It started the way a properly functioning machine starts, cleanly, with immediate hydraulic response, with the gauges settling into their correct positions within seconds. The engine note was even. The arm controls responded at first touch. Logan ran the arm through one full range of motion, watching the hydraulic behavior at extension and retraction. Then he powered down, climbed out of the cab, and descended the side of the machine. The applause started before he reached the ground. Not the organized kind, the instinctive kind, the kind that happens before anyone decides whether it's appropriate. A dozen workers clapping, a few calling out. Ruiz, the operator, was shaking his head slowly with an expression of disbelief and gratitude. Logan walked to his toolbox, closed the trays in sequence, and latched it. Natalie said nothing. She stood with her arms at her sides, watching him, and her expression was not the one she'd worn when he walked through the gate. That one had been dismissal. This one was something else, something she hadn't fully identified yet. 15 feet away, the lead site engineer, a careful, methodical man named Beckett who had been on infrastructure projects for 11 years, had taken out his phone. He wasn't making a call. He was typing something into the search bar. Something with Logan's name in it. He looked at the results for a moment. Then he looked at Logan. Then he looked at the results again. He put his phone in his pocket and said nothing. The excavator ran clean. Around it, the site slowly resumed its rhythm. Tools were picked up. The concrete pump operator returned to his station. Somewhere at the back of the lot, someone started a compactor. 23 minutes. From the time Logan had opened his toolbox to the time the machine restarted, 23 minutes. The manufacturer's field tech was still 40 minutes away. The call from Derek Shaw came 40 minutes after the excavator restarted. Shaw was Vaughan Infrastructure's operations director, a position that gave him authority over project compliance, vendor management, and liability exposure. He was good at his job in the way that certain people are good at their jobs, not through vision or technical mastery but through a meticulous attention to the structures that governed how work got done. He knew contracts. He knew regulations. He knew the exact language of the state infrastructure oversight framework that covered every public works project Vaughan was currently running. He called Natalie while she was still on site, standing near the office trailer, watching Logan Mercer carry his toolbox back toward the gate. "I heard you've got a non-contracted individual who performed work on the 390F, Shaw said. "I have someone who fixed the machine," Natalie said. "On a state contract site. Without vendor certification on file. Without a liability waiver. Without being on the approved contractor list." A pause. "Natalie, if there's an incident on that machine in the next 30 days, we are exposed. Completely exposed. His work isn't covered. Our insurance carrier will. The machine is running. That's not the issue. It was the issue at 7 this morning." Shaw was quiet for a moment. "I'm flagging this formally. I need you to tell me he's off-site, and we're documenting this as an informal consultation. No work performed. Just an observation." Natalie watched Logan reach the gate. He didn't look back at the site. He didn't look toward the office trailer. He pushed through the gate and let it close behind him. "I'll call you back," she said. She ended the call. The problem with Shaw's position was that it was not wrong. She knew that. He was describing a real exposure, a genuine liability architecture, the kind of thing that caused project shutdowns and insurance disputes and procurement audits. She had managed those before. She knew exactly what they looked like from the inside, and they were worse than most people assumed. But she had also stood at 15 feet and watched a man diagnose a fault in 23 minutes that 11 engineers, 2 mechanics, and a remote technical line had missed entirely. She had watched him work with a precision that was neither rushed nor performed, just a clean application of knowledge that had been built up over time and never lost. She was aware of the tension between those two things. She was also aware that Logan had not asked for anything. He had not asked to stay. He had not negotiated a rate or requested a contract or suggested that his presence was indispensable. He had simply fixed the machine and walked back to the gate, as if the outcome was the end of his involvement and the beginning of someone else's decision. She walked to the trailer. Inside, the site coordinator, a woman named Patty, who had been with Vaughan Infrastructure for 16 years and who maintained the project files with the quiet authority of someone who understood that institutional memory lived in the paperwork, was pulling something from the filing cabinet. "I was going to bring this to Ellison," Patty said without looking up. But I think it should go to you. She placed the printed document on the desk. The cover page was dated 4 years ago. At the top, in the standard Vaughan infrastructure header, Maintenance Protocol Submission, Equipment Systems Division. And below that, in the author field, L. Mercer. Natalie looked at the first page for a long moment. Through the trailer window, she could see the site. The excavator was running again. Rees was back in the cab, moving earth, the arm swinging in its low arc across the foundation trench. Everything looked normal. Everything looked like a project that was on schedule. She picked up the document and read the first 3 pages. Logan was in his truck. She could see it from where she stood, the dark blue pickup at the fence line, the figure getting into the driver's seat. He would be gone in under a minute. She picked up her phone. The document was 71 pages long. Patty had found it in the secondary archives, not the digital system, the physical one, the row of binders in the back of the trailer that held everything that predated Vaughan's transition to cloud document management in 2021. It had been filed under a general heading, External Protocol Submissions, 2018 to 2020. There were 14 documents in that binder. Most of them were vendor proposals, equipment specs, a few maintenance recommendations from manufacturers. The Mercer document sat between a compressor service manual and a quarterly equipment utilization report, unremarkable in its placement, indistinguishable from the others by anything except its contents. Patty had found it because she had started looking after Beckett, the lead site engineer, had come into the trailer at 8:40 and asked, in a carefully casual voice, whether they had any historical maintenance submissions on file from outside contractors. He hadn't said why. He'd had his phone in his hand when he asked, and Patty, who noticed things, had noticed that. She had found the document in 11 minutes. She had read the executive summary and the first diagnostic section, and then she had read the diagnostic section again. Then she had brought it to the desk and waited for Natalie. The proposal had been submitted to Vaughan Infrastructure in March of 2019. The covering letter described the document as a maintenance interval framework for heavy excavator systems, specifically the 380 and 390 series, with expanded provisions for hydraulic pressure management under variable load conditions. It had been submitted through Vaughan's standard vendor intake process, assigned a reference number, routed to the Equipment Systems Division, and, as best Patty could reconstruct from the file, incorporated into the company's internal maintenance protocol within 8 months of receipt. The protocol currently in use on the Hartwell Crossing site was the 4th revision of that document. Logan Mercer's name did not appear in it. Natalie had read the proposal's hydraulic diagnostic section twice by the time she understood the connection fully. The diagnostic clarity in Logan's work that morning, the specific nature of his attention, the 2 things he had found that no one else had identified, it had the texture of something authored rather than observed. Something built from the inside out. Now she stood in the trailer with the document in her hand, reading a passage in section 4 that described, in precise technical language, the failure mode produced by a blocked hydraulic intake combined with a pressure relief valve drifted outside tolerance under load. She read it once. She set the document down. She looked out the window at the site. Logan's truck was still there. The engine wasn't running yet. She picked up her phone and called the number the gate security log had recorded when he'd checked in that morning. It rang once. He picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Yes." She chose her words carefully. "Can you come back to the site?" It was not quite a question. On the other end, there was a brief quiet. She heard what might have been a child's voice in the background, a soft exchange, a rustling. Then Logan said, "Give me a few minutes," she said. "Take the time you need." She ended the call and looked at the document again. Section 4. Hydraulic System Diagnostic Sequences, Failure Modes and Field Correction. The language was technical but not impenetrable. It was the language of someone who had learned to write for the people who would actually use the document, not for the people who would file it. The methodology he had used that morning was in here. Not approximately. Precisely. She sat down at the desk and kept reading. Outside, through the trailer window, the excavator moved steadily across the trench. Ruiz was running it at 3/4 throttle, a smooth rhythm, responsive and clean. The machine sounded like a machine that had been understood. By the time Logan came back through the gate 20 minutes later, Natalie had read 40 pages. She had also made 2 phone calls, one to Derek Shaw, brief, and one to Vaughn's legal department, briefer. She had not told either party what she intended to do. She had asked questions and listened to the answers and formed her own judgment. Logan crossed the site yard without hurrying. He carried only his toolbox. He didn't look around at the site as if he owned it, or as if he'd been away. He simply moved through it the way he moved through everything, with an attention that was functional rather than possessive. Natalie met him at the trailer steps. She held out the document. "Do you recognize this?" He looked at the cover page. Something in his expression settled, not surprise, not bitterness. A kind of acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a thing you knew existed without having looked for it. "Yes," he said. "The diagnostic sequence you used this morning is in section 4. "I know." She studied him for a moment. He was looking at the document with the same quality of attention he'd given the excavator, not performing anything, just reading what was there. "I have a crane that's showing early stress indicators," she said, "and a compactor that's starting to run rough." Logan looked up from the document. He looked at the crane in the distance. He looked back at her. "I'll need a workspace," he said. The compactor began losing ground pressure the following morning. It happened gradually at first, the kind of degradation that shows up as reduced output before it shows up as anything measurable. The crew running the sub-base compaction on the eastern approach noticed it before the instruments did. The machine was making passes, completing cycles, generating numbers within tolerance, but the feel of it was wrong. The Earth wasn't responding the way it should. An experienced operator knows this the way a driver knows when brakes are going soft, through a quality of feedback that precedes any gauge reading. The operator reported it at 6:50. The site engineer ran diagnostics at 7:15. The readouts were ambiguous, nothing clearly out of range, but nothing confidently within it. The recommendation that came back from 2 engineers and a brief phone consultation with the manufacturer's technical line was a manufacturer service call, 3 to 4 business days for a factory-certified tech to be scheduled and dispatched. 3 to 4 days on the eastern approach meant 3 to 4 days of schedule slip on the sub-base compaction, which meant schedule pressure on the form installation that followed, which meant the main concrete pour, already carrying a 1-day buffer after the excavator incident, would be operating without margin. Natalie was at the site by 7:40. She listened to the engineer's assessment. She looked at the diagnostic readout. She looked at the compactor. She called Logan. He arrived in 45 minutes. He didn't have June with him this morning, a Wednesday, which meant school. He came through the gate alone, toolbox in hand, and walked to the compactor without stopping at the office trailer. He spent 3 minutes examining the machine externally. He didn't open anything yet. He walked around it once, crouched at 2 points, pressed his hand against the vibration housing with the machine idling, and listened. Then he opened the rear access panel. The eccentric bearing, the component responsible for generating the vibratory force that gave the compactor its function, was seated inside a housing that required a specific sequence to access. Not complicated, but not obvious. Logan reached it without referencing any documentation and extracted the bearing assembly in 8 minutes. The bearing showed where that was characteristic of a specific type of loading pattern, the kind that developed when the compaction frequency had been set slightly too high for the material density being worked. It was a judgment call, the kind made daily on sites by operators managing schedules and material variability. It was also the kind of call that, made consistently over several weeks, produced exactly this kind of bearing where without producing any fault codes. Logan had a replacement bearing in his truck. It was not a coincidence. He had assessed the compactor's service history from the documents Patty had pulled, and he had understood what he would likely find, and he had prepared for it. Not dramatically. He had simply put the right part in his truck before driving to the site. He installed the replacement in 11 minutes. He ran a calibration cycle and adjusted the eccentric frequency setting to a value more appropriate for the material currently being worked. He showed the operator the correct range, not on a readout, on the machine itself, at the physical control, and explained what to listen for. The compactor ran clean. 10 minutes. The diagnosis, the extraction, the replacement, the calibration. 10 minutes and 45 minutes of driving time. Natalie watched him walk back from the compactor toward the equipment yard. She fell into step beside him. "The crane," she said. He looked toward it. The large tower crane at the north end of the site had been running without incident for 3 months. Its maintenance logs were current. Its inspection certificates were valid. There was no recorded issue. "The slew ring fasteners on the third collar," Logan said. "They're showing micro-fatigue patterns consistent with the load cycles you've been running." He paused. "Not critical yet. But the schedule you have for the main pour in 3 weeks puts the crane at peak utilization for 14 consecutive days. At that load profile, you're looking at a failure risk in the 6-week window." Natalie was quiet. "You haven't run the crane diagnostics," she said. It was not a question. "I looked at it this morning, from the ground." He said it without elaboration. "If you adjust the load schedule for the next 2 weeks and bring forward the collar inspection, you'll be fine for the pour." She looked at the crane. At the site around it. At the schedule board posted on the outside of the site office. The color-coded grid of tasks and timelines that represented months of planning and coordination. "If you're wrong," she said. "I'm not wrong," he said. Not defensive. Not a performance of confidence. Just accurate. She stopped walking. He stopped a step later and looked at her. "I'll need the load schedule from your project manager," he said. "And access to the crane inspection logs." Natalie pulled out her phone and called Ellison. Behind them, the compactor was moving across the eastern approach, making a steady pass, the vibration frequency dialed exactly where it needed to be. The Earth was responding now. That quality had returned to it, the settled solidity that meant the machine and the material were working together. Ruiz, watching from near the excavator, had his arms crossed. He was watching Logan move through the equipment yard with an expression that was not quite reverence, and not quite relief. It was the expression of someone watching a kind of competence that doesn't announce itself, and doesn't need to. He turned back to his own machine and started his pre-operation check. The memo arrived on a Thursday morning. Natalie found it in her email at 6:47, 20 minutes before she arrived at the site. It was from Derek Shaw, copied to Vaughan Infrastructure's legal department, the state contracts compliance office, and the project's external oversight auditor. The subject line read, "Contractor Compliance Concern, Hartwell Crossing." The body of the memo ran to 4 paragraphs, precisely structured, each one a self-contained building block in a case that Shaw had clearly been assembling since the morning the excavator restarted. The first paragraph cited the State Infrastructure Oversight Framework's vendor certification requirements for work performed on public works sites. The second paragraph noted that Logan Mercer was not on Vaughan's approved contractor list and had not signed a site services agreement. The third paragraph identified 3 specific work actions: the excavator repair, the compactor repair, and the crane assessment, as potentially constituting unauthorized maintenance activity under the framework's definitions. The fourth paragraph recommended that Logan's site access be suspended pending a compliance review and that all work he had performed be independently recertified. It was a careful memo. It was not wrong about the framework requirements. It was not fabricating a risk. Natalie read it twice on her phone in the parking lot of a gas station, holding a coffee she hadn't yet opened. Then she drove to the site. She did not call Shaw. She called the firm's contractor compliance coordinator, a person named Rosa, who worked out of the regional office and had managed Vaughan's vendor certification database for 8 years, and she asked one question: what was the current status of Logan Mercer's independent contractor certification? Rosa checked. It took 4 minutes. Current, she said. Renewed 11 months ago. Valid through the following year. All liability endorsements present. Natalie said thank you and ended the call. She understood the distinction now, clearly. Shaw had identified a genuine procedural gap. Logan hadn't been placed on the approved vendor list before being permitted to work, and he had framed it as a compliance violation. But compliance and procedure were not the same thing. The certification that made the procedure possible, the underlying credential that the approved vendor process was designed to verify, was current. The process had been skipped. The substance the process was meant to confirm existed. Shaw understood procedures. He understood them better than almost anyone at Vaughn. But he was using them the way certain people use tools, not to accomplish the work, but to prevent it. She called the oversight auditor directly, circumventing the usual chain, and briefed her on the certification status. The auditor, a meticulous woman named Chin who had been doing this work for 20 years, asked 2 questions and said she would note the procedural irregularity in the record and consider it addressed pending Logan's formal addition to the approved vendor list. That took 11 minutes. Logan arrived at the site at 7:30. Natalie met him at the gate. There was a compliance memo, she said. He looked at her without surprise. Shaw? She looked at him for a moment. You've met him before? Not him specifically, Logan said. The memo. She understood what he meant. Not the person. The mechanism. The way organizations protect themselves from what they don't control by framing it as a risk. She told him about the certification, about Chin, about the resolution. He listened without expression. You didn't need to do any of that, he said. I know. I wanted to. She paused. Your certification was current. It's always current, he said. Not because I need it. Because it closes the door before they think to open it. She looked at him. There was something in that sentence, a long familiarity with institutional friction, a practiced management of small bureaucratic anticipations, that told a story more completely than any CV would have. He had been here before. Not on this site, not with this project. But in this situation. The man whose work was wanted before his name was established, and whose name became a liability once the work was done. He hadn't fought it. He had simply made himself harder to exclude. Shaw was reassigned to the firm's materials procurement division later that week. Natalie did not announce the reassignment. She communicated it to the relevant managers with a single sentence: operational restructuring to better align project compliance oversight. No one on the Hartwell Crossing site was told directly. Ellison noticed that Shaw's name stopped appearing in the site communication threads. He said nothing. Logan never mentioned it. The main concrete pour began on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the excavator had gone silent. It started at 5:40 in the morning, before the sun was properly up, when the first trucks arrived and the pump crews took their positions. It was the kind of operation that required everything to be right simultaneously: the mixture ratios, the pour sequence, the vibration protocol for the forms, the weather window, the crane load schedule that Logan had quietly recalibrated 2 weeks before. A dozen interdependencies that had been planned for months, and that could still fail in an hour if any of them slipped. Nothing slipped. The excavator ran clean. The compactor had been operating at the correct frequency for 3 weeks, and the eastern approach sub-base was solid. The crane handled its loads within the adjusted schedule Logan had specified, the slew ring fasteners performing without incident, the micro-fatigue arrested by the early inspection and the load redistribution. The pour team worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and the concrete moved through the forms the way concrete is supposed to move, evenly, without voids, settling into its geometry with a kind of finality. At 3:17 in the afternoon, Ellison signed off on the milestone documentation. The main pour, complete and within spec. He held the pen over the form for a moment before signing it, not out of hesitation but out of the brief pause that comes when something that has been a problem, even a potential problem, stops being one. Natalie signed the copy. She dated it. She walked the pour site one more time, looking at the forms, at the surface, at the drainage channels, at the place where the bridge would eventually carry traffic over the river. It looked like what it was, a piece of infrastructure, precise and unglamorous, built correctly. She went back to the office trailer and sat at the desk. After a while, she opened her email and typed a message to Logan. It was 3 sentences. She read them over and deleted the third one, which had been a personal acknowledgement she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to offer. She sent the 2 that remained. The 390F is running clean. The port came in on schedule. She sent it and closed her laptop. Logan's reply came 22 minutes later. 6 words. Change the hydraulic fluid on schedule. She looked at it. There was no sentiment in it, no acknowledgement of the project's success, no closing note, no social padding. Just the next thing the machine needed. She picked up her phone and called the site foreman and told him to add a hydraulic fluid service to the 60-day maintenance schedule for the 390F. The foreman, who had learned over the past 3 weeks not to ask why when Logan's name was implied, said he'd update the log. She put her phone down. The project would run for another 4 months. There would be other issues. There were always other issues on a bridge project of this scale, but they would be the ordinary kind, the kind that project management and engineering judgment could address. Nothing hidden. Nothing that looked normal and wasn't. Outside, the site was still in operation, the afternoon crew running a form inspection on the secondary spans, a materials delivery being staged at the north lot. The excavator was parked, its shift done, hydraulic arm lowered. It sat in the late afternoon light with the quiet authority of machinery that has been properly understood. Natalie looked at the 6-word email one more time. Then she added the maintenance note to her own calendar and moved on to the next item. They came on a Sunday because there was no work on Sunday. Logan parked the truck at the edge of the access road, where the gravel ended and the compacted earth began, at a point from which you could see the bridge in its current state, forms still in place on 2 of the secondary spans, the main deck exposed and curing, the structure taking its permanent shape in the way that concrete takes its permanent shape, which is slowly and without announcement. June sat in the passenger seat eating crackers from a small bag. She looked at the bridge with the practical curiosity she brought to most things. "Is it done?" she asked. "No," Logan said. "Not yet." "When?" 4 months. Maybe 3. She considered this. "Will it be here a long time?" Logan looked at the bridge. At the deck, at the approach sections, at the lines of reinforcement visible at the form edges. He thought about the concrete below, about the bearing plates, about the hydraulic systems that had been correctly serviced, and the crane that had performed within its recalibrated limits. "Yes," he said. "A long time." June went back to her crackers. Somewhere across the river, a bird made a sound and didn't repeat it. The morning was still. The bridge stood in it the way structures stand when they are doing what they were built to do, which requires no effort and makes no noise. Logan's phone rang. He looked at the screen. "Natalie," he answered. "Mercer. The secondary span forms come down Wednesday," she said. "I wanted you to know." "All right." A pause. Not uncomfortable. "I thought you might want to see it." He looked through the windshield at the bridge. At June, who had finished her crackers and was now watching a hawk circle above the far bank. "I can see it from here," he said. Another pause. Then, "There's a highway overpass project starting in the fall. South County. The equipment profile is similar." He said nothing for a moment. "Send me the specs." "I will." The call ended. Logan put the phone in his pocket. June looked at him briefly, then looked back at the hawk. It had found a thermal and was rising without moving its wings, held up by something invisible. "Can we get breakfast?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "In a minute." He sat for another moment, looking at the bridge. Not with sentiment. With the quiet attention of someone checking his work, not to find fault with it, but to acknowledge that it was there, that it held, that the thing he had understood was now built into something that would carry weight for years. Then he started the truck and pulled back onto the access road. The excavator was not the first thing that stopped that morning, 7 weeks ago. There had been smaller failures before it, smaller corrections, the invisible maintenance of systems that people used without thinking about. But the excavator was the first thing that stopped where someone noticed. And from that noticing, other things had started. The bridge stood in the morning light and said nothing. That was enough.